Thank you, Keith, for that lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure and an enormous honor to stand here as the historical cuckoo in this grandest of art historical nests.
There's a synthesis.
The thing I'm most interested in a student is curiosity.
To be able to make sense out of that. We're very kind of focused on
Keith Christensen and Stefan Weppelmann have assembled a wonderful exhibition.
rather than just making stuff. We've got enough stuff.
They've displayed with consummate skill and
Wonderfully
wonderfully weighed drama a stunning range of sculptures, paintings, medals, drawings, illuminated books. And their work has opened up for all of us one of 15th century Italy's magnificent obsessions. It's artists and patrons' passion for the portrait. Portraits of men and women, portraits of adults and children, evoked in all of their complexity and images in 2 and in 3 dimensions. Portraits that could be rubbed between the hands, portraits admired on the walls, and of course there was a further range of portraits in frescoes and other media that even the Met couldn't transfer from Italy to here. My humble historian's task today is not to discuss the works of art themselves so much as to lay in part of the background that can help to explain why they were created. The passion for making portraits that inspired so many artists pervaded Italian society and culture in the 15th century. In writing as in painting, in Italian as in Latin, the effort to record for the world the experiences and sensibilities, the characters and emotional lives of individuals provoked creative acts of writing as multiple, as skillful, and as exuberantly varied as the arts of visual portraiture on display a floor above here. By looking briefly at the words of biographical and autobiographical writers from the 15th century, we will, I hope, understand even better what drove patrons to commission and artists to make a range of works. The connection between portraits and words and portraits in other media is clear really from the very outset of the story that the exhibit tells. In the early 1430s, Leon Battista Alberti, scholar, mathematician, author a few years later of the first modern treatise on painting, modeled a brilliant, if slightly amateurish, the finish is not perfect, and he didn't really know how to tie that knot. Not 10 write anything, and not 3 survive to make an impression. Odds which look even worse than the legendary scholarly job market of the moment. Yet when Alberti set out to portray himself, he characterized himself not as the retiring scholar of his little book on the eye which fortunes and misfortunes of learned men, but as a hawk-like visionary, Roman in dress and Roman in profile. His hair perhaps slightly resembling the leonine hair of his friend of the moment. Yet when Alberti set out to portray himself, he characterized himself not as the retiring scholar of his little book on the fortunes and misfortunes of learned men, but as a hawk-like later patron, Leonello d'Este, eventually Marcus profile. His hair perhaps slightly resembling the leonine hair of his friend and later patron, Leonello d'Este, eventually Marquess of Ferrara. Next to the image of his face, a stunning range of sculptures, paintings, medals, abbreviated illuminated, and his emblem, the winged eye, which he liked to accompany with his emblem.
There's a synthesis and a synergy that exists out there, and it's a designer's job to be able to make sense out of that.
You want to make something of it? Here Alberti emphasizes the soaring power of the eye, the eye which he claimed to be the frescoes and other media that even the eye which could transfer from Italy to here. My humble historian's task today is not to discuss the works of art themselves so much as to lay in part of the background that can help to explain why they were created. The passion for making portraits that inspired so many artists pervaded Italian society and culture in the 15th century. In writing as in painting, in Italian as in Latin, the effort to record for the world the experiences and idealized vision. It sends a message about the person that he wanted to be. Alberti matters for the story of Portraits, he knew and worked with both Matteo de' Pasti and Pisanello, whose work you see here, masters of the profile portrait in metal form. It's one of the genres in which the portrait really spreads from Florence into the courts of Ferrara, Mantua, and Urbino, where those artists worked. Like those two men, he was a prolific and expert portraitist. He drew and modeled the faces of his friends while they talked to him, and threw away any portrait that a child couldn't recognize the original of. Sadly, they all seem to have been thrown away. We have only one or two pieces of work by him. He told readers of his treatise on the art of painting that paintings that had a portrait in them worked differently from those that did not, had a different power on onlookers, and he asked artists at the end of that book if they appreciated it to put his face into their work. I think it's very clear that both his example and his encouragement played a role in the new fashion for portraits of individuals as it spread into the courts of which he was a habitué. Unlike de' Pasti and Pisanello, however, Alberti didn't confine his efforts at portraiture to visual media. He also wrote, in the 1430s, an autobiography, a precocious one, given that he was only a little more than 30 years old. It's modestly couched, like the works of Julius Caesar, in the third person. And it's as vivid and brazen in its own way as the portrait plaquette. Alberti tells us, was a brilliant athlete. He could jump over the head of a man standing next to him from a standing start. He could throw a coin so high that it rang as it hit the ceiling of the Florentine Duomo. Wounded in the foot as a teenager, he not only bore the doctor's painful sewing up of his wound without crying out, but held the edges of the wound together, singing to distract himself. He loved to look at handsome old men, but mourned depressed when he went out into the fertile fields and saw their fruits. Most remarkably of all, he made a special practice of handling and looking at the things he loathed, such as honey and garlic, until he no longer shrank from them. And he thus, the book says, offered an example to show that men can make anything of themselves if they wish. It's an extraordinary claim, all the more extraordinary because elsewhere in the biography, Alberti tells of the depression and delusions that had almost paralyzed him in his years as a student. Alberti made clear in the life, in a way exactly as he had made clear in the plaquette, that he saw art as the key to making one's way in society. Not only the visual arts, however. Above all, he said one must apply the greatest artistry in three things: walking in the city, riding a horse, and speaking. And a further art must be added to the other three, namely, none of these must be seen to be done
most interested in a student is curiosity. The thing I'm most interested in a student is curiosity. There's a synthesis and a synergy that exists out there, and it's a designer's job to be able to make sense out of that. We're very kind of focused on user-centered design and making sure that the students do something smart with their work rather than just make more stuff. We got enough stuff.